Good morning and welcome or welcome back to our conference on the dignity of the dead. Welcome everyone here in Potsdam and of course at home on Zoom. This conference has a long prehistory. My first proposal to the Einstein Forum team dates back to 2015. I had already been doing research on Soviet war monuments for some time, and had gotten into a habit that is as common among us necro scholars as it is exasperating to our families. Wherever I go, I visit cemeteries, memorials, and other grave sites. That summer, during a holiday with friends at Lake Garda in northern Italy, I had a chance to visit, in the space of a single day, several sites representing together radical changes in the treatment of the dead that occurred over the space of just a few decades. Following the unification of Italy, many of the dead of the Italian independence wars were housed in ossari, ossuaries built mostly during the 1870s and 80s that displayed multiple symbols of nationhood and royal and military glory, but followed traditional Catholic practice in the way it presented the dead. Instead of laying them to rest as intact individuals, the creators of the ossari arranged their bones by type, skull by skull and one tibia next to another. I'm not showing the most graphic images here, this should suffice. All of it on full display as a memento mori, a reminder of human mortality and equality in death before God. Though originally a way to move old bones out of the way and make space for new bodies to be buried in sacred ground. But not far from these ossari, one can find new kinds of memorials, some of them dedicated to the same wars. Monumento sacrari that hide the remains of the dead from view, yet mention them by name, celebrating their military achievements and thereby singling them out for eternal glory based on the fact that they died as soldiers. These memorial monuments were built in the 1920s and 30s after the fascist takeover of power in Italy. Most of them were dedicated to the numerous Italian dead of the First World War, along with sites such as the Serbian chapel at the Zeitenlik Allied Memorial in Thessaloniki. They are among the grandest and most impressive examples of the monumental cult of the war dead that emerged in Europe after World War I. Some of these sacrari also retroactively rearranged the remains of those who died in the Italian independence wars, such as the Garibaldian red shirts who fell in 1866 at Bezzecca, whose remains were exhumated from a church graveyard and reburied along with some of the Austrian soldiers who died in the same battle. What fascinated me about this rapid transition was something that had long before me intrigued anthropologists and historians of death, mourning, and burial, such as Jeffrey Gorer or Philippe Ariès. They and many others since then have written about the evolution of Western attitudes towards death. An evolution from close interaction and exposure to dead bodies, and in some cases, what one might call an analytical approach to the various parts, to practices that became more and more mediated, symbolic, hiding the dead from view through novel taboos. While at the same time, interpreting the notion of equality before death as an imperative to name the dead individually, while arranging them not primarily as members of their family or parish, but as representatives of the nation. What struck me about this was that this transition was never complete. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, we continue to put some dead humans on display. Sometimes in Orthodox or shamanistic cultures, for example, because they are saints. Sometimes in the name of science, from early modern cabinets of curiosities via Jeremy Bentham to the plastinated specimens displayed as part of Gunther von Hagens's body worlds, and similar exhibitions. In the case of Lenin's body, on which we will hear more today from Alexei Yurchak, sainthood and medical science might even be said to converge, even though sainthood, as we heard yesterday, is a problematic category. Some of these presentations in physical space or in photographs attract widespread condemnation, while others, oddly, do not, or not anymore. I was, of course, aware of the debate surrounding Lenin's body that Alexei mentioned in our discussion last night, but I was also a regular visitor to Orthodox monasteries from provincial Russia to Mount Athos. And I knew that the practice of looking at and touching saints' relics, and most recently of taking selfies with them, was considered completely unexceptional. When I suggested that we organize a conference around these topics with the working title, "The Dead Among Us," the response from my colleagues was positive but guarded. Sensing a certain squeamishness, I decided to shelve the idea for a while. A few years later, the COVID-19 pandemic struck, bringing mass death and the constant fear of death back to countries that had been sheltered from such experiences for a long time. Among much superficial discussion, I came across one interview that struck me as by far the most intelligent and nuanced analysis of pandemics, the relationship between humans and other animals, and the role of microbes in their interaction that I had ever read. The interviewee was Friedrich Keck, and I immediately suggested that we invite him to speak in the new series that the Einstein Forum was launching at the time, titled People, Things, and Animals. Friedrich ended up giving a Zoom talk in that series on his fieldwork among what he calls Chinese sentinel posts in Asia. And in our post-talk conversation, he told me about his fascinating project on human skulls collected from Senegalese baobab trees and the interplay between museums, archaeologists, microbiologists, microbes, and source communities around these human remains. When I also learned that Friedrich was coming to Berlin for a semester, I decided, if you forgive the pun, to revive my old idea for a conference about the dead and propose that we organize it together. Not least because, as an anthropologist, he would, of course, bring deeper and broader expertise to the matter than I could. I also thought that it would be a good fit for our series, People, Things, and Animals. The series stresses that beings other than humans, including inanimate objects, can be social and historical agents. But conversely, as dead bodies forcefully remind us, humans are not just agents and social beings, but also material objects that are subject to certain physical processes. And how we deal with these bodies is a response to this dual fact. Leibniz and Stutz will talk about this in a moment. Our planning was already quite advanced, and we had sent out a number of invitations when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I should say that the war in Ukraine has been a constant backdrop to my work since it began in 2014. Ukrainian colleagues I was already working with on war commemoration at the time were directly affected by it. And of course, it completely altered the meaning of practices commemorating the dead of the Second World War, while also demonstrating the continued hold that the Soviet-era imaginary about the dead continues to exercise over us today. The most poignant, moving, and nuanced English language book about the war in Ukraine was written by Olesya Khormeychuk, a brilliant historian of the Second World War and its aftermath in Ukraine. In 2017, her oldest brother was killed on the front lines after he had volunteered for the Ukrainian army to fight in the Donbass. In one of the many striking passages in her book, she writes about the moment she first saw her brother's dead body. The first thing I thought when I saw him in the morgue was that he looked like Lenin. He never looked like Lenin in life. I thought I must be going mad. He had a high forehead and a little beard, like Lenin in those pictures I saw as a child. And that must have made me think of Lenin lying in the mausoleum. So the ongoing war was never completely off my mind, not least because I was working with Ukrainian colleagues who taught me a great deal about my own subject matter and made me revise many of my previously held Russo-centric assumptions. Some of them were now displaced inside their country, and I always admired how many of them kept their ability to engage in level-headed analysis of war commemoration and the treatment of the dead of the Revolution of Dignity and the Donbass War. But now, on the 24th of February, war struck with full force, affecting everyone I know in Ukraine, but also in Belarus and Russia. It was a brutal emotional shock. I was spending all my time trying to help friends and strangers, and continuing to plan a conference on dead bodies seemed wildly inappropriate under circumstances when my own friends and colleagues were in constant mortal danger. It was my continued interaction with colleagues in Ukraine, many of them working in incredibly difficult conditions, losing their homes to Russian bombs or facing brutal military occupation, that convinced me that we could and should continue talking about the topic, but shedding any pretense of detached neutrality. With images of the war dead beginning to circulate in the traditional media and online, debates about what it meant to treat the dead with dignity became pressing everyday questions. Not least for those of us trying to keep the atrocities happening in Ukraine on the forefront of attention in Western societies, while making sure to do so without disrespecting the dead and their surviving relatives and friends. Hence the new title of the conference, The Dignity of the Dead. Irina Sklokina, one of the most knowledgeable experts on the subject, will join us on Zoom from Lviv this afternoon to talk about how these topics are being discussed in Ukraine today. Thus, at the intersection of Frédéric's research interests and mine, and to reflect different aspects of these trying times of war and plague that we are living through, this conference has two main thematic strands. One concerns the treatment of those who die as a result of wars, mass murder, or pandemics. We will hear about victims of the Holocaust, of the Soviet policies of deportation and forced labor in Neria Putinait's talk this afternoon, of the Rwandan genocide tomorrow from Małgorzata Wosińska, and of course the ongoing war in Ukraine from Irina Sklokina. We will discuss the question of how the manner or circumstances in which people lived and died affect the way we treat their bodies. Do we treat friend and foe differently? We will hear, of course, about Lenin, whose public display, as Alexei Yurchak already mentioned last night, marked a radical break with previous practices, such as practices of burying monarchs. In fact, the new revolutionary culture, the new revolutionary commemorative culture at the time, paradoxically ended up creating a new hierarchical model of burial that ran counter to the egalitarian tendencies that were spreading in Western countries during the same period. The greater your contribution to the revolution, the closer you would now be buried to the center of power. The Kremlin wall provides an example of this, and the concentric structure of North Korean revolutionary martyrs' memorials and cemeteries is one among many striking examples of how this culture has now spread to numerous countries across Africa and Asia. In the Soviet case, this hierarchy was then also applied to the army, meaning that at the end of the Second World War, where and how and whether you were buried and whether you were mentioned by name had to do with whether you were an army officer, a decorated hero, or a simple soldier, seemingly the exact opposite of the egalitarian promise of the communist revolution. Talking about all of these questions in Germany is particularly interesting because of Germany's traditionally very rigid system of rules for burial and for the treatment of those already buried, encapsulated in the daunting composite noun Friedhofsordnung, set of rules for cemeteries. We will hear more about this tonight and also about how this is changing from Sarah Benz, a funeral director and grief counselor. The other strand concerns what one might call the secondary treatment of dead bodies, or parts thereof, especially the European colonial practice of gathering them in the name of anthropological or medical science in collections that grew out of cabinets of curiosities, such as Peter I's Kunstkamera, the Russian Empire's first museum. We already had several contributions on this theme last night, so I won't go into much detail here. But what is interesting is that in both of these categories of cases, there have been many recent changes. museums now seek to restitute human bodies and body parts from their collections. Holger Stöcker, who was going to talk in detail about a recent case of restitution, unfortunately won't be able to make it to the conference for health reasons, but we have already touched upon this in last night's debate, and Frédéric tomorrow morning will talk about an especially complex case. Regarding the bodies of victims of epidemics and wars, on the one hand, the rise of social media is intensifying the circulation of images of suffering and death that Susan Sontag famously wrote about, and which before her, Luc Boltanski analyzed as constitutive of the modern European public sphere since its emergence in the 18th century. On the other hand, the cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust has established certain kinds of expectations about what we do or do not do with the bodies of victims of mass murder. Every recent event, from Rwanda, genocide in Rwanda, to the ongoing war in Ukraine, is almost automatically made to fit that model. But as Małgorzata Wosińska will show, Holocaust memory does not really provide us with universal models for how to treat the dead of other mass murders and catastrophes. And Rwanda is a very important counterexample here. To talk about the treatment of the dead of the ongoing pandemic and how it is changing burial practices in Western Europe, we had originally invited Gaëlle Clavandier, who has studied these questions in the case of France and Switzerland. Unfortunately, she too couldn't make it due to a health emergency, but instead, Frédéric has secured a contribution from Guo Yueshan, who has studied these questions in the case of China, and will join us on Zoom from Beijing and answer our questions about how Chinese funerary practices are changing as a result of the pandemic. So this concludes my brief survey of the topics that we will touch upon today and tomorrow. And now I'm very happy to welcome Liv Nielsen Stutz. No one really is better suited to give an in-depth and at the same time sweeping overview of how the treatment of the dead has changed, because she has studied the question both as an archaeologist and also with reference to present-day museums and the various conundrums that they face in trying to decide what to do with the collections that they still hold. So before opening the floor to her, I just want to give you a few reminders about Zoom. So those of us joining us on Zoom are very welcome at any point during the conference to participate with questions or comments. To do so, please do not use the chat function. Instead, please use the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of your screens. The moderator of each session will be able to see your questions or comments and then to read them out. For those of you joining us on Zoom as presenters, you have the option of using the chat right directly to the moderator, or to give us a sign saying that you would like to contribute directly, and then we should be able to put you on display for everyone to see here in Potsdam. Having said that, once again, I would like to welcome all of you, to thank you for coming all the way to Potsdam, and to give the floor to Liv.